Olivia's words were dismissed as childish imagination. Her teacher laughed. Her classmates snickered, all because she claimed her father was Chuck Norris. That's impossible, they said. Why would someone like him be your dad? But what they didn't know was that her truth didn't need to be proven to them. It would show itself when the time came. So, who was the real joke here? Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Monday morning at Meadowbrook Elementary always smelled like pencil shavings and cafeteria toast. But today, the air in the teacher's lounge carried something else, something sharper. Mrs. Langford leaned against the vending machine, sipping her lukewarm coffee. "You won't believe what Olivia Carter said last week." She chuckled, shaking her head. "She claims Chuck Norris is her father." A few of the other teachers smiled awkwardly, some too polite to respond. Mr. Rowan, the music teacher, glanced up from his grading and offered a flat, No one corrected her. No one asked if she was sure. It was the way she said it. Langford went on, lowering her voice into a mocking whisper. "My daddy's Chuck Norris." Like she expected us to clap. The room didn't laugh. Not really, but no one stopped her either. Back in class, the overhead lights hummed faintly as Olivia sat quietly in the second row. Her notebook was open, though she hadn't written anything since roll call. She wore the same pink hoodie she had on Friday, the sleeves too long for her arms, the cuffs fraying at the ends. "All right, class," Langford called out as she wrote the new vocabulary list on the board. "Let's see who's ready to impress." Before Olivia could raise her hand, Liam, always loudest when he sensed attention, blurted out, "Hey, Chuck Jr. Got any karate moves for us today?" Laughter bubbled through the room. It wasn't cruel at first, just thoughtless. The kind of laughter that spreads fast because it's easier than thinking. Olivia didn't answer. She just looked at Liam, then back at her desk. Later, during free reading time, she quietly pulled a small photo from her folder. The corners were bent, the ink faded. In it, a much younger Olivia stood beside a man with familiar eyes and a hard, crinkled smile. His hand rested gently on her shoulder. Chuck Norris, or someone who looked very much like him. She held it up toward Mrs. Langford, not with pride, but with something closer to defense. "Proof." Langford barely looked. "Sweetheart," she said, voice suddenly syrupy. "Fake photos don't make your stories more believable." More snickers. Someone whispered, "Nice try, Photoshop." Olivia turned her face to the window. She didn't cry, but her hand tightened on the edge of the desk until her knuckles whitened. Mr. Kevin, the teaching assistant, noticed the exchange. He paused halfway through stacking returned books, then glanced at the photo Olivia had left out. He said nothing, just turned, walked to the back of the room, and busied himself with filing worksheets. The bell rang. Chairs scraped, backpacks sipped, students flooded out, still buzzing with leftover giggles. Olivia didn't move. She sat still in her seat, the photo now face down on the table. The room emptied around her. Nobody picked it up. Outside the window, a janitor pushed a mop cart across the sidewalk, moving slowly through the falling leaves. Inside, Olivia sat with her back straight, eyes lowered. She hadn't come to class today hoping to make a point. But somehow, her presence, her insistence on a simple truth, had become a joke. Again, and though no one said it aloud, the message had been made clear. Some truths, depending on who you are simply not allowed to be believed. Dinner at the Carter household had always been a quiet affair. But that night, the silence pressed a little harder than usual. Sandra Carter noticed it before the first spoonful of mashed potatoes touched her daughter's plate. Olivia sat with her shoulders slightly hunched, fork barely moving, eyes fixed on the rim of her glass like it held a secret only she could see. Sandra didn't push, not right away. She'd learned over the years, especially since Olivia's father had stopped appearing in public, that her daughter spoke not in bursts, but in pauses. When the meal had all but gone cold, and Sandra had asked her once, softly, "Everything okay at school?" Olivia didn't answer at first. She simply shifted her fork and whispered, "They don't believe me." Sandra blinked, putting down her glass. "About your father?" They laughed. They said I made it up. Mrs. Langford told everyone. A long pause. They think I'm lying. The words were small, not angry, not even sad, just tired. Sandra reached across the table, placing her hand over Olivia's. But the girl didn't look up. The next morning, Sandra dressed in her neatest slacks and blazer, the ones she used for church on Easter, and walked into Meadowbrook Elementary with her head high and jaw set. She didn't ask for an appointment. She simply waited in the main office until the receptionist, visibly flustered, called down to the principal's suite. Mr. Harris, a man whose tie always seemed 1 inch too short, greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Carter, how can I help you? Sandra explained, calmly, factually, that Olivia had told the truth, that she had every right to be heard without ridicule, that she had proof. A printed copy of the school's own invitation to Chuck Norris for their upcoming Inspiration Day. Harris sighed as if he'd been handed a fragile vase he hadn't asked for. I understand how sensitive children can be, he said gently, folding his hands on the desk. But you know, at her age, especially without a father figure actively present, children tend to fill in blanks. Create fantasy. It's not uncommon. My daughter doesn't lie, Sandra replied, and she shouldn't be punished for speaking the truth. I don't believe anyone is punishing her. Harris said smoothly, I'll speak with Mrs. Langford. But perhaps Olivia needs guidance, maybe even counseling. This might be about something deeper. Sandra left the office without another word, not because she agreed, but because she knew when a conversation had stopped being a conversation. Later that day, Olivia returned to class with a folded letter in her hand, official. From the district's office. It had the school logo and her father's name in formal font, an invitation. Signed, dated, stamped. She handed it to Mrs. Langford after recess. The teacher glanced at it, then handed it back without reading the entire page. This must be a mix-up. I've never seen this. Maybe the front office confused some names. Happens more than you'd think. Olivia's voice was barely above a breath. It's from the school. It's real. Mrs. Langford gave her a smile that didn't soften her eyes. Sometimes, Olivia, when we want something to be true, we convince ourselves it already is. But wanting doesn't make something real. Olivia's cheeks burned. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. A few students were watching now. Liam raised an eyebrow. One girl in the back tried to catch Olivia's eye but looked away when she couldn't hold the gaze. You're disrupting the lesson, Langford said crisply. Please take your seat. I wasn't. I said take your seat. And then, with a pause so precise it stung, or step outside. Silence. Olivia picked up her letter, her fingers trembling as she folded it back along the worn creases. Then she walked slowly to the door. Before she stepped out, she turned back once. Kevin, the assistant teacher, stood by the whiteboard, arms crossed, face unreadable. Their eyes met for half a second. He didn't say a word. She stepped into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind her. Down the corridor, a janitor pushed his mop past the lockers. A girl's laugh echoed from another classroom. Olivia stood there, small against the backdrop of beige walls and laminated posters that claimed every child mattered. Inside that room, she'd told the truth, and once again, it had no weight, not because it wasn't true, but because of who she was. That evening, Sandra sat alone at the kitchen table. The soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. The room was dimly lit by the warm glow of a single lamp. She opened her laptop and navigated to the school's email archives, fingers trembling slightly as she searched for the confirmation email from the district office. It took a moment to load, but there it was. A message from the school's administration, dated several months ago, the invitation to Chuck Norris for the school's Inspiration Day event. She clicked open the email, just as clear as it had been the first time she saw it. The email header bore the school logo, the subject line confirming Chuck Norris's attendance. It was there, signed, dated, and even included a special note from Mr. Harris. She took a screenshot, then printed out the pages with the heavy, crisp sound of the printer warming up. Sandra paused for a moment, looking at the printed page in her hands. It was hard to ignore the discomfort gnawing at her. Something felt wrong, like a mismatch in the narrative. It wasn't just the email, it was the way Olivia's truth had been dismissed so quickly. The way the adults around her had so easily written her off as a liar. She folded the printout carefully and placed it into an envelope. "Tomorrow, we'll fix this," Sandra whispered to herself as she turned off the computer. But as she walked past Olivia's room, she could already feel the weight of the task ahead. Olivia was hurt, and no matter what Sandra did, she couldn't protect her daughter from the cruelty that often came when someone like Olivia tried to be seen. The next morning, Olivia, dressed in her usual school clothes, a soft sweatshirt and jeans that were too big for her, held the envelope tightly in her hands as she walked to school. The day had dawned cold, with a crispness in the air that sent a shiver up her spine. She looked down at her feet as she walked, her mind racing with what lay ahead. Would it matter? Would anyone believe her now? At the school gates, Olivia hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had half a mind to turn back, to avoid the cruel laughter of her classmates, the sneers from Mrs. Langford. But she didn't. She walked forward, step by step, her legs feeling heavier with each stride. Just as she passed the flagpole, Marcus, the school security guard, called out to her. "Hey, Chuck's kid," he said softly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Olivia stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. Marcus was a tall, broad-shouldered man, with a weathered face that hinted at a life filled with stories he didn't share easily. He was always there, but never in the way. Quiet, observant, but this time, he was watching her closely, his expression unreadable. "You're Chuck Norris's kid, right?" he asked again, his voice low and steady. Olivia nodded slowly, surprised by the sudden recognition. "Yeah, I think so." Marcus's gaze softened, and he took a step closer. "He came here once. I was the one who helped him park when he visited." Olivia blinked. "You remember?" Marcus smiled, a slight nod. "I remember. I even kept the footage from the security cameras that day. You know, in case anything weird happened. Can't be too careful with visitors like him." Olivia's heart fluttered. This was the moment she had been waiting for. But somehow, it felt too easy. She wasn't used to people believing her. Not like this, not without hesitation. "Can you help me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to prove it. To everyone." Marcus regarded her for a moment, as if measuring the sincerity in her request. Then, without saying a word, he gestured for her to follow him. He led her around the side of the school building, past the usual commotion of children playing and laughing, until they reached a small maintenance shed. The shed, like Marcus, seemed forgotten, tucked away from the rest of the world. Inside, he pulled a dusty laptop out of a drawer. "It's old, but it still works," he muttered as he powered it on. Olivia stood silently, watching him. She had so many questions. But for now, all she could do was watch Marcus's steady hands as he navigated through the computer. "I'll show you," he said, finally. "But remember, this stays between us. No one else needs to know about this." Olivia nodded. "I won't tell anyone, I promise." After a few moments, the screen flickered and came to life, displaying the security footage from several months ago. The timestamp on the video was clear. Marcus clicked play, and Olivia watched as the grainy video showed a familiar figure, her father, walking across the school parking lot. His posture was unmistakable. The video was shaky, but there was no mistaking the man she had seen in pictures all her life. "That's him," Olivia whispered, barely able to contain the excitement building within her chest. "That's my dad." Marcus stopped the video and looked at her. "It's real, kid," he said quietly. "I'm not gonna let anyone tell you otherwise." For the first time in a long while, Olivia felt something she hadn't dared to feel before. Hope. The following Saturday was an overcast one, and the air inside the school gymnasium felt cooler than usual. The long, folding tables were set up along the sides, and a handful of parents had already taken their seats, murmuring to one another as they glanced at their phones. Olivia and Sandra arrived early, both of them walking through the doors with their heads held high. Olivia, however, felt like a weight had settled in her chest. Sandra's footsteps were steady, but her mind was racing. She had spent the entire week preparing for this moment, gathering everything she needed: the printed emails, the signed invitations, even the copies of Olivia's past academic records. Everything was set. Everything was in place. But in truth, The weight she carried wasn't just the papers, it was the feeling that this would be another battle in a long list of fights Olivia never asked for. Olivia sat in the front row with her hands clasped tightly together, her fingers pressing into the palms of her hands. She was quiet. She had been quiet for days now. Sandra knew that her daughter felt the enormity of this fight deep inside. Just as Sandra did, it was no longer about Chuck Norris. It was no longer about a father's presence or an invitation that was conveniently erased. It was about standing tall in a place where no one else was standing up. When the meeting began, Mr. Harris, the principal, stood at the front, speaking in his usual monotonous tone, welcoming the parents and discussing various school-related issues. He looked at the clock, glanced at his notes, and made no mention of the reason why they had all gathered there. The issue had been brushed aside before, but now, it was too big to ignore. Sandra stood up, quietly, but her movement caught the attention of the room. She didn't speak right away, just walked slowly to the front, carrying the envelope containing the papers. The room quieted as everyone turned to her. It felt like the moment stretched out forever. But Sandra could hear nothing except her own heartbeat and the rustling of Olivia's breath behind her. She opened the envelope slowly, ensuring everyone could see the documents she'd brought. She placed them on the table in front of Mr. Harris. This, Sandra's voice rang clear in the gym, is the proof. The email invitation from the school, signed by your office, confirming Chuck Norris for the event. I have the follow-up email as well, where this event was cancelled only days after. My husband was unable to attend, because this invitation was erased. Sandra paused, letting her words sink into the silence. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't a misunderstanding, it was deliberate. The room was dead quiet. Mr. Harris's face tightened, his eyes flickered briefly toward Mrs. Langford, who was sitting in the front row, visibly uncomfortable. Well, Mrs. Carter, Harris said after a long pause, clearly flustered. I'm not sure how this slipped through, but I'm sure it was just a system error. Something we missed on our end. We're looking into it. Langford, sitting beside him, opened her mouth, trying to find a way out. It must have been a technical glitch. She stammered. We've had issues with scheduling before. And Olivia must have. Well, she could have misunderstood. I'm sure of it. But Sandra wasn't backing down. No, Mrs. Langford, my daughter didn't misunderstand. This was intentional. You didn't want her to speak the truth. And that's the heart of this whole mess. Just as Sandra's words hung in the air, the door to the gymnasium opened, and Marcus, the school security guard, stepped in, his presence larger than life. His footsteps echoed as he walked toward the front, and he paused behind Sandra. No one expected him. Marcus had been quiet until now, always observing, always in the background, but now he stood tall, a silent force in the room. He placed a laptop on the table in front of everyone, clicked a few buttons, and the screen came to life, showing a grainy video recording. The timestamp was clear, as was the image of Chuck Norris stepping into the school parking lot. The camera moved, capturing him walking into the building. Olivia's father, alive and present, just as she'd said. Marcus didn't say a word. He simply stepped back, letting the footage speak for itself. Sandra glanced at Olivia, whose gaze never left the screen. Olivia's eyes were no longer filled with doubt. They were clear. They were strong. She wasn't just watching her father on screen, she was watching the truth unfold before her. Her story was no longer a joke. Kevin, the assistant teacher who had been silently watching from the back, stood up slowly. I remember that day, he said, his voice cutting through the tension. I saw that letter being printed. But then I saw someone. Someone told me to tear it up. Liam, the boy who had mocked Olivia before, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked down at the floor. There was no laughter now, only silence. Some parents, now fully engaged, began pulling out their phones, starting to record the moment. The whispers that had been confined to corners of the room grew louder, more urgent. A few heads nodded, as if this was no longer something to ignore. Olivia didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen. She didn't need to say a word. The truth had been revealed. And for the first time, it was being heard. Mr. Harris looked around, the weight of the room pressing on him. Langford, now pale and shaking, didn't meet anyone's gaze. The truth was out. And there was no escaping it now. The room had been filled with whispers. The tension palpable, when the door at the back of the meeting room creaked open. No announcements, no fanfare, just the heavy, deliberate sound of footsteps. Chuck Norris stepped into the room. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. No one spoke. There was no gasp of surprise or murmur of recognition. The man, as real and solid as the truth itself, stood in the doorway, looking calm, collected, his presence quiet but undeniable. His face was weathered, familiar yet timeless, like the kind of man whose mere silence commanded respect. Olivia felt a rush of warmth flood through her as her father walked slowly toward her. Without a word, he placed his hand on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. She looked up at him, her heart beating faster, not out of fear, but out of something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time, hope. The steady strength of her father's touch steadied her, and the weight she had carried for so long seemed to lift. Just a little. Chuck Norris's gaze swept over the room, meeting the eyes of every single person there. When his eyes landed on Mrs. Langford, the teacher who had dismissed his daughter's truth with such ease, he held her gaze for a fraction longer than necessary. "Olivia doesn't need to convince anyone that she's my daughter," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "All she needs is to be believed when she speaks the truth." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Sandra, standing just behind Olivia, couldn't help but feel a rush of pride for her daughter. Olivia hadn't said a word to her classmates. She hadn't fought for validation. And yet, here was Chuck Norris, standing for her, not with grandeur, not with bravado, but with a quiet dignity that made everything seem possible again. Langford's breath caught in her throat. She stood, visibly flustered, her mind scrambling for something to say, anything to claw back her control. I'm not discriminatory," she stammered, glancing nervously at Mr. Harris. I follow the procedures. The school has rules." The excuse sounded weak, even to her own ears. But she pushed on, hoping that somehow, the room would let her off the hook. Sometimes, kids, especially ones without fathers at home, they need structure. They make up stories. It's a cry for attention. It was a feeble defense. And as she said it, she could see the doubt that crossed the faces of the parents in the room. She was no longer sure of her own words. Before anyone could say anything more, a voice broke through the murmurings of the crowd. A woman from the back row stood up, her expression one of quiet but steely resolve. She was older than most of the parents present, but there was something undeniably strong in the way she held herself. "I don't think you remember me," she said, her voice rising slightly as she stepped toward the front. "But 3 years ago, my son, he applied for the special education class here. And you told me, point blank, that he couldn't join because his father works as a janitor. You said he was unqualified." Gasps rippled through the room. Sandra's heart sank, but Olivia's head snapped toward the woman, recognizing the courage in her words. She hadn't expected this, but she understood now. This wasn't just her battle, it was everyone's. Kevin, the assistant teacher who had silently observed from the back, stood up slowly. His voice, for the first time, was steady and unwavering. "I thought you were just strict, Mrs. Langford," he said, his gaze now fixed firmly on her. "But now I see, you don't just enforce rules. You decide who gets to be heard." The silence in the room was deafening. Mrs. Langford's face drained of color. Her eyes darted around, but there was nowhere left to hide. She was cornered, her own actions now laid bare for everyone to see. It wasn't just a slip-up. It wasn't a mistake. It was something worse. It was prejudice. It was choice. It was power used to silence the ones who didn't fit. Langford collapsed into her chair, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. But no one spoke to comfort her. No one tried to explain away her actions. Marcus, the security guard, stood at the back, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. He had always been a quiet observer, someone who'd seen too much and said too little. But today, his silence felt like justice being quietly served. The parents, once passive, began to murmur amongst themselves. A few pulled out their phones, taking pictures, recording. Whispers turned to discussions, and discussions turned to outcries. Someone started filming, and someone else began to clap. The quiet voices of doubt from before were now replaced by the stirring winds of a collective truth. Liam, the boy who had teased Olivia earlier, sat with his head bowed. The arrogance he'd worn so comfortably moments before had faded. The reality of what had been exposed settled in his chest, and he didn't know what to do with it. So, he did nothing. He simply sat there, face flushed with embarrassment. Olivia, still standing by her father, hadn't said a word through it all. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes. And the truth? The truth was now louder than any voice in the room. As Mrs. Langford sat there, shrinking in on herself, she realized that this wasn't a confrontation she could win. Not anymore. No one told her to leave the room. No one ordered her to step down. But she knew it was over. Everything she had tried to suppress was now in the open, exposed for all to see. And in that moment, Olivia didn't need to speak. Because for the first time, the silence was on her side. The video from the school meeting spread like wildfire across the internet. In it, Chuck Norris made his entrance, silent, calm, yet undeniable, followed by Olivia, her gaze unflinching in the midst of the storm. And then, Sandra's voice, steady and firm, declaring the truth that had long been silenced. The footage was raw. There was no media spin, no glamorous framing, just the truth, unvarnished and clear. The hashtag believe Olivia surged to the top of trending topics. And hashtag Chuck Norris daughter quickly became a symbol of quiet resilience in the face of systemic bias. The comments poured in, thousands of them, voicing anger, disbelief, and support. Parents, teachers, and even strangers from across the country condemned the underlying prejudices that had festered in the halls of Meadowbrook. They questioned the very framework that allowed a teacher like Mrs. Langford to make sweeping judgments based on nothing more than assumptions. One post from a parent read, "How many more children have been silenced like this? How many stories have been dismissed, just because of where they come from, or what their families look like? Enough is enough." The outrage wasn't just from the students or the parents, it was from the broader community. Waking up to the reality that the systems meant to nurture the next generation had failed to nurture them at all. In the wake of the viral video, Meadowbrook High School had no choice but to respond. A press conference was scheduled for the following week. The principal, Mr. Harris, stood before a sea of cameras, his face more solemn than ever. He cleared his throat and began, "We have decided to place Mrs. Langford on administrative leave while a full investigation is conducted. This matter is of great concern to us, and we are committed to ensuring a learning environment that is fair and just for every student." There was a brief pause. The room was filled with murmurs, the press hungrily scribbling notes. And then, unexpectedly, Mr. Harris turned to Marcus, the security guard who had quietly played his part in exposing the truth. "Marcus," Harris said, his voice steady but with a hint of reluctance, "you've demonstrated integrity in a way that many of us, myself included, failed to do. Your actions were commendable, and the school will be recognizing your bravery." The camera lights flashed as Marcus stood, his expression unreadable. He had never sought recognition. But in that moment, he understood something profound. Sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't require a name on a plaque. It simply requires doing what's right, regardless of the cost. On social media, a quiet wave of support continued to grow. Kevin, the assistant teacher who had been an observer until now, posted a heartfelt message on his personal account. "For too long, I stood by, believing that silence kept the peace. I was wrong. My silence was complicity. From this point forward, I stand for truth. I stand for what's right." The post was shared thousands of times. Kevin's message struck a chord with many who had quietly doubted their own role in the events that had transpired. The following week, a new face appeared in the classroom. Mrs. Jenkins. She was a teacher who had been previously turned away from Meadowbrook because her history didn't fit the school's narrow view of who should be allowed to teach. She was too close to the community, her background too modest, and her connections were questioned. But now, in the wake of the scandal, the school reached out to her. She wasn't just hired to fill a vacancy, she was hired because the school, in its quiet crisis, was starting to reflect on the kind of institution it wanted to be. She stood before the class, her presence a stark contrast to the cold, dismissive attitude of her predecessor. Her gaze was kind, but sharp. She was no stranger to adversity. The past is not something to be ashamed of, she said gently to the students. It's something we learn from. And we must always ask, who do we listen to? Who do we believe? The new signs outside the school, hung beneath the dim lights of the main entrance, spoke volumes. They read, "We are committed to listening, before we judge." It wasn't just a slogan. It was a promise, made not just by the administration, but by everyone who worked there, who learned there, who lived within its walls. And for the first time, the school felt like it was beginning to live up to its own ideals. As Olivia walked past the new sign on her way out of school, she couldn't help but pause, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the lettering. It wasn't just a statement. It was a shift, a change, subtle but profound, had begun. Olivia had faced her battle not with loud protests, but with quiet resolve. The truth, once buried, had found its way to the surface. And now, it was too loud to ignore. And just like that, the world around her had begun to listen. The gymnasium was filled with the low hum of murmurs. The bleachers creaked under the weight of hundreds of students, parents, and faculty. Today was the Day of Inspiration, a tradition at Meadowbrook High, where students would stand up and share their stories of triumph, courage, and growth. Olivia was supposed to be just another speaker, another child who was expected to inspire, expected to impress. But as she stood behind the podium, something inside her had shifted. The microphone seemed so distant, almost irrelevant, like a tool she no longer needed. The faces before her weren't waiting for her to prove herself anymore. They were waiting for her to speak her truth. She didn't have to introduce herself with grand statements. She wasn't the daughter of a celebrity. She wasn't going to boast about who she knew or what her father had done. Olivia Carter had learned, through years of being dismissed, ridiculed, and silenced, that her voice was enough without any embellishments. She cleared her throat softly, then took a long pause, letting the silence fill the space between her words. When I was little, my dad used to tell me that the strongest person in the room isn't the one who shouts the loudest. Olivia began, her voice steady but soft. It's the person who can stand firm in the truth, even when the world laughs at them. She paused again, looking down at her hands. The nerves that once clawed at her chest had faded into a quiet sense of calm. She had nothing left to prove. She had already won. Olivia smiled, just a little. Today, Chuck Norris's daughter doesn't need to prove anything. But I am a girl who knows that the truth will never need to shout. The words hung in the air. A powerful, simple declaration. Olivia's gaze swept over the crowd. But she didn't linger on any one face. Instead, she felt a soft weight lifting from her shoulders, the weight of expectations, of doubts, of every moment she had spent questioning whether she belonged. She turned slowly, walking off the stage with quiet grace. The crowd, however, remained frozen for a moment. Then, one by one, they rose. The applause began softly, tentatively, but soon it grew louder, the sound of approval and recognition swelling like a tide. But Olivia didn't turn back. She didn't need to. She had already said everything that needed to be said. She had already done what she came to do. The rest, whatever others thought or felt, was no longer her burden to carry. As she made her way out of the spotlight, the large screen at the front of the gym flickered to life. The final words of her speech appeared, simple yet profound. She didn't raise her voice, but they all fell silent. The gym fell into a silence that was as profound as any applause. It wasn't just respect, it was awe, it was understanding. In those few words, Olivia had shown them all what true strength looked like. It wasn't the loudest voice. It wasn't the most confident. It was the voice that refused to be drowned out, no matter how hard the world tried to silence it. The audience, still standing, still clapping, understood that something had changed. Not just for Olivia, but for all of them. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand attention. But somehow, her silence was louder than the laughter that once echoed around her. It's funny how the truth doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes, it's the quiet moments that shake the foundation of what we believe. How many of us have stayed silent for fear of speaking out? And how many of us, when given the chance, will choose to listen? Justice doesn't always come with a grand gesture. Sometimes, It simply waits until we're ready to see it.